For many years, the heritage of Prince Philip's relatives persisted as a silent, closed vault inside monarchical archives, seldom accessed, seldom probed. Yet, when an intimate remembrance was declared to celebrate them, nobody foresaw one specific choice rattling the institution to its foundations. Surprise registered, pulses paused, and the household descended into crisis as Philip's living kin ended their quietude, supporting Catherine while barring Camilla's access. The events that followed were set to reveal fissures the institution had desperately hoped humanity would never witness. Ahead of our further examination of this incident's true impact on the royal house, be certain to register so you catch every new development. From the instant the remembrance was made public, a faint feeling of strain already existed among the monarchy's closest members. This was not merely an homage, it was a convergence of heritage, of memory, and of monarchical lineage seldom recognized. Prince Philip's sibling, Princess Sophie of Hesse, had vanished from popular recollection, yet her descendants, residing chiefly in subdued dignity around Europe, retained their ancestry and ideals. Therefore, as the attendee list for this intimate function was compiled, Buckingham Palace did not impose the terms. Philip's sisters' relatives did, and their determination struck like a bolt of lightning. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would be celebrated and received. Camilla, the Queen Consort, would be omitted. Within the residence, the quiet that ensued was far from tranquil. Aides hurried frantically. How could this overt reprimand be allowed to happen? Still, this was not simply a slight. It was a communication. Supporting Catherine signified raising her status, not as a temporary figure, not as a future consort, but as the legitimate spiritual successor to a lineage that consistently watched carefully from obscurity. Their backing for Catherine was not just ritualistic, it was founded upon deep respect. Her silent fortitude amid turmoil, her unwillingness to be pulled into the household's uglier conflicts, and her steadfast dedication to heritage had been observed by related European ancestries. However, it was the exclusion of Camilla that genuinely sparked speculation inside the residence. Was the motive individual, tactical, or a question of ethical standards? Contacts near the relatives hinted at a more persistent factor, a lasting recollection that Camilla embodied all the elders rejected: scandal, disorder, and the erosion of established norms. A source murmured the choice stemmed from conviction rather than spite, noting profound anger at how Camilla's ascendance altered monarchical history in a manner seen as insulting to Philip and his era's heritage. In private, Charles was reportedly furious, yet unnervingly controlled, choosing to manage the crisis instead of worsening it. Catherine, conversely, stayed quiet, though contacts reported she was profoundly affected by the action. That quietude functioned as her defense and her declaration. Concurrently, Camilla's non-attendance at the event, conspicuously unaddressed, fed media reports, conjecture, and a reinforced feeling of disharmony within the royal confines. Yet the public was unaware that this rejection was not impromptu. It was driven by a past the institution wished to keep dormant, and the following details uncover its origins. Well before Catherine entered the monarchical sphere, a tempest was already forming, originating from the calamities, infidelities, and pledges within Prince Philip's personal ancestry. His siblings' relatives had weathered what they termed 100 years of repercussions, and upon observing Catherine, they perceived an attribute Camilla could never embody. To comprehend their support, one must grasp the injuries and allegiances that formed them and the reason this remembrance reactivated those feelings. Beneath the veneer of monarchical propriety existed a past filled with damage. Prince Philip's sibling, Princess Sophie, and her kin had survived banishment, degradation, and seclusion. They observed their ancestry being edited from the formal accounts, marginalized to promote a more acceptable version of the past. However, they retained the memory. And as rumors emerged that Philip, in his final years, had entrusted them with his aspirations for the institution's ethical core, they held fast to his statements. Reportedly, he discussed stewardship based not on lineage, but on character. And Camilla's name was never mentioned by him in that regard. It was an individual more subdued, one still lingering in the periphery. The relatives' backing of Catherine was not merely tactical, it was intimate. They perceived in her an embodiment of their personal principles: quiet endurance, fortitude amid stress, and commitment without fanfare. As Camilla ascended, they watched uncomfortably how the institution adjusted to accept her, leaving a resentful feeling for many. For them, her control signified a deviation from Philip's cherished ideals: integrity without compromise, and service without alteration. A source alleges that correspondence penned in Philip's last months conveyed anxiety about the heritage being altered swiftly, not accurately. That message, while never released, was purportedly displayed confidentially to relatives from his sister's lineage. It solidified their determination. They remembered the hushed discussions, the meaningful actions, the telephonic contacts following significant events. Catherine had consistently made contact, not seeking influence, but seeking comprehension. Conversely, Camilla maintained her separation, and in the space left by that quietude, mistrust occupied the vacuum. The relatives started to pray themselves for the time they must communicate, not with language, but through decisions. The remembrance service provided that opportunity. It served as their platform, their declaration, and their chance to connect Philip's legacy with the institution's future. While the attendee roster was being composed, significant individuals were designated with confidential annotations. Catherine's name was encircled, Camilla's was absent. And when a high-ranking assistant challenged the exclusion, he was purportedly informed, "This is not an official event. This is lineage acknowledging lineage." Underpinning that feeling was a tempest of feeling, unresolved past injuries, and a decision destined to resonate for ages. The motive was not insulting Camilla. It was safeguarding something more profound than external perception, something holy to people who awaited the opportune time for decades. And as the attendee roster was disclosed, the institution at last comprehended what was imminent. This resulted immediately in the volatile occurrences of the next phase. The remembrance invitation was intended as a procedural matter, something dignified, confidential, and meticulously managed. Conversely, upon the discovery of one particular phrase, palace assistants hurried, telephones rang incessantly, and high-level staff became visibly distressed. Camilla's name was absent, not misplaced, not ignored, but intentionally deleted. And on the corresponding line, Catherine's presence was designated as mandatory. The resulting situation within the residence's confines approximated a strategic collapse. In the moments after the paper was distributed privately, pandemonium ensued. Assistants hurried to verify if it was a preliminary version. It was not. The document had already been dispatched individually, immediately, and conclusively. There was zero uncertainty. The attendee roster carried the official validation of Prince Philip's sister's kin, authorized and finalized. And when one assistant ventured to propose a potential administrative mistake, the reply was immediate and severe. This was intentional. You shall not alter the past a second time. That phrase, allegedly uttered by a high-ranking individual from the Hesse lineage, reverberated loudly through the institution's secretive hallways. There was to be no mitigation of the statement, no tactical reinterpretation. Camilla was explicitly excluded. The disturbance inside the institution was immediate. High-level assistants discussed releasing a supplemental statement, but they swiftly understood the harm went beyond procedure. It was deeply individual. Catherine, seeing her own name designated as mandatory, was reportedly unable to speak. Previously, she had been omitted from more intimate monarchical functions, citing reasons of rank or custom. Yet on this occasion, the door was held open solely for her, and she comprehended the significance. This was not merely an act of acceptance, it was a promotion, an affirmation, and a direct affront to the entire established system. Within the residence, frictions escalated to a critical level. A few worried this violation might provoke a popular outcry, or, more severely, a covert conflict between the monarchical cliques. Charles was caught unprepared, and Camilla, discovering the omission, allegedly insisted on a personal justification, which never materialized. Her counselors attempted to lessen the impact, proposing the relatives had justifications. She remained skeptical. And as additional information emerged regarding the discussions, the stipulations, and the past resentments, it was obvious to her this was not an oversight in logistics. It was a repudiation of the heritage she had spent years constructing. In confidential settings, the atmosphere was desolate. A source depicted it as a memorial inside a memorial, where the cessation of quietude felt more profound than the grief itself. And as formal announcements were composed to project cohesion, the actuality was severe. This summons had triggered a massive conflagration. The situation now involved persistence, public image, symbolic meaning, and heritage. Catherine stayed quiet, yet her quietude held significance. Camilla, concurrently, was confronting a predicament extending much further than the remembrance event. This concerned being viewed as invalid by a segment of the lineage whose quietness had been misconstrued as irrelevance. However, the institution had misjudged the resolve underpinning this choice. It was a resolve that became irrefutable in the subsequent events. Catherine had not requested this validation, and she absolutely never anticipated becoming the symbol of Philip's sister's heritage. However, the deeper her comprehension of the family's insistence on her attendance, the more the reality disturbed her. She was not merely being included, she was being burdened with a responsibility that was archaic, intimate, and agonizingly weighty. And as the date approached, Catherine understood the remembrance involved significantly more than commemoration. Confidentially, she wrestled with comprehending the burden abruptly settled upon her. This did not concern official engagements or ritualistic obligations. It concerned a bequest, not of rank, but of faith. Philip's sister's kin were not extending an invitation. They were requesting she bear a load that had festered for decades. In hushed discussions, they referred to Catherine as a protector, an individual capable of safeguarding what they felt was gradually eliminated from the institution's morality: honor, obligation, and self-denial free of aspiration. Catherine, invariably serene externally, found herself psychologically shaken in seclusion. She questioned them, "Why me?" And their reply remained consistent: "Because you still trust in the ideal it represents." For Catherine, that explanation resonated profoundly. She had invested years determining her role, maneuvering through controversies, enduring hostile centers of authority, and mastering composure during crises. And presently, this subdued defiance of allegiance from Philip's overlooked lineage was depicting her not merely as a prospective queen, but as an ethical anchor. It was a position she had not pursued, yet one they declined to bestow upon another individual. The harder she attempted to redirect, the more their determination solidified. This was not about adulation. It was about the preservation of their reality, their recollections, and their suffering. William observed the strain it was inflicting. He understood Catherine more than any other person. He watched her withdraw into contemplation, her desire for food disappear, her tone soften in the period preceding the remembrance. One night, he purportedly cautioned her, "They are pulling you into a matter larger than mourning." And he was not incorrect. This was not merely a tribute. It was a confrontation of the institution's present path. Catherine was being framed as the antithesis of Camilla, the personification of what the traditional establishment felt the monarchy ought to embody. As the last arrangements for the remembrance concluded, personal correspondence reached Kensington Palace. Every letter was penned by hand, each bearing the insignia of aristocratic families absent from contemporary monarchical events for years. Their communication was unambiguous: "We have not forgotten, and we select you." Catherine wept that evening, not from happiness or stress, but from at last grasping the actual significance. These were not summons, they were affirmations of trust, offered by individuals who had been quieted for ages. She started to review old records, correspondence from Philip, saved communications, fragments of a mystery that formed a sharper image of his connection to his sister's relatives. They contained cryptic meanings, cautious hopes, and pieces of an aspiration to safeguard the institution's essence above political concerns. And at this moment, that aspiration was being transferred to her. On the eve of the remembrance, Catherine waited solitarily in the stillness of her chamber. No recordings, no orations, just an individual bearing the resonance of an ancestry, resolved to endure. Yet nothing could ready Catherine or the institution for the events that transpired when the remembrance at last commenced. From the instant Catherine crossed the threshold, it was evident this was not a standard monarchical assembly. Gazes tracked her, discussions halted, and Philip's sister's kin welcomed her with a deference the institution had not foreseen. In their expressions, movements, and hushed phrases, a single communication emerged clearly. She was the selected individual. But as Catherine settled into her position, she perceived the pressure of an additional entity, Camilla's fury hovering externally, awaiting its opportunity. The chamber was saturated with legacy, not opulence. However, the events within its confines would inflict a more profound wound than any open controversy. While Catherine proceeded with measured elegance, individuals from the wider kinship, some unknown to her, others having lived in silent banishment for years, stood quietly. It was a meaningful motion, not pre-recorded, but spontaneous. A senior aristocrat touched Catherine's hand with her lips. A German relative slipped a creased message into her grasp. These actions were not pleasantries, they were affirmations. Catherine was not merely accepted, she was pivotal. And each acknowledgement, every chair provided, every hushed comment made it agonizingly obvious. This was not the institution's platform. This was Philip's heritage recovering its influence. Her personnel awaited information. Her countenance, according to observers, was impassive. She had never previously been excluded from any monarchical function. Within, her name was not spoken, yet her non-attendance vibrated in the atmosphere like a caution. Catherine, perpetually serene, could perceive the strain. Each instance of deference shown to her amplified the silent fissure between the institution's history and its disputed current state. As the remembrance proceeded, discussions became enigmatic. An elder relative from Austria murmured this was long anticipated. A Polish aristocrat commented he would have desired her presence, not the alternative. These were not arbitrary reflections. They were tactical revelations. The relatives had readied for this. Their acceptance of Catherine was not spontaneous, but was arranged, nurtured, and ultimately unveiled. Each statement, each look, conveyed intention. Catherine, positioned in the foremost row, now grasped that this assembly was not just an homage. It was a judgment, veiled as commemoration. Among those present, the established figures of influence, the counselors, the remote kin aligned with the institution, started to sense the change. Boundaries were being redefined, not by official edict, but by historical loyalty. The institution, previously damaged by ages of controversy and private mistrust, now confronted a more nuanced, perilous type of division. It was a breach originating not from defiance, but from recollection. And Catherine, regardless of her wishes, had emerged as the silent focal point. When the last oration concluded, and the relatives readied to depart, the strain felt palpable, like static. Assistants monitored their devices. Camilla's convoy remained stationary nearby. And in the quietude following the remembrance's concluding benediction, an understanding emerged. This was not the conclusion of the matter. It was the start of a situation none could entirely manage. And that clash ignited in an unforeseeable manner, as detailed in the subsequent events. Camilla appeared without invitation, resolute, irate, and refusing to be marginalized. Yet, as she neared the Remembrance Hall's access point, Philip's kin remained steadfast, articulating their rejection plainly to her. What ensued was a strained, hushed impasse that combined anguish, blame, and decades of unsettled conflicts. Onlookers subsequently described it as the instant the institution fractured completely. Accompanied by her personal protection detail, but lacking an official palace attendant, Camilla exited her vehicle with clear determination. She did not intend to create a disturbance, she asserted, but merely to respect the individual whose heritage she had sought to protect alongside Charles. However, her appearance, uninvited and contrary to explicit requests, was interpreted as an act of aggression. At the entrance to the remembrance chamber, she was confronted not by assistants or protectors, but by two of Philip's most senior living kin. They communicated not with hostility, but with solemn gravity. They requested she depart discreetly, resolutely, and without disturbance. What started as an entreaty escalated into a dispute. Camilla refused to yield. She maintained her privilege to offer condolences. She referenced her rank, her matrimony, and her decades of duty. Yet the relatives remained resolute. One, an elderly duke, a contemporary of Philip's wartime experiences, stated merely, "Rank is not heritage, respect is acquired." The statement struck forcefully. What ensued was a conflict, not of volume, but of principles. Camilla insisted on knowing why she was being omitted from a past she felt she had assisted in restoring. They responded with anguish that had previously been unvoiced. They discussed shattered customs, ethical injuries, and observing the institution accommodate concessions while their own self-denials were silently ignored. The strain intensified as the moments elapsed. At one juncture, Camilla allegedly inquired, "Does this concern Catherine? Is this a theatrical display to elevate her prematurely?" A relative retorted with a sharp observation, "Catherine never demanded. You consistently did." That instant quieted even Camilla's assistants, who recognized this extended beyond the remembrance. It involved infidelity, sorrow warped into animosity, and integrity confronting recalcitrance. Within the remembrance, murmurs of the dispute started to spread. Catherine was notified privately. Her countenance remained static, yet her confidants later conceded she appeared noticeably unsettled. She understood this clash was unavoidable, though not in this manner. She had never desired conflict, never pursued being the proverbial line in the sand. However, her attendance was now the precise factor causing the ground to fracture under the institution's footing. Prior to departing, Camilla offered a concluding observation destined to inflict more damage than any closed entryway. Gazing at the individual who had refused her, she stated, "You will lament rejecting the institution. This lineage invariably consumes its members." After that, she pivoted, returned to her vehicle,
and departed without a sound. Yet the harm was already inflicted. The communication was delivered, and the rift was not quiet any longer. And as the reverberations of that dispute propagated, the institution prepared itself for the repercussions. These were detailed in the concluding summary. As the entryways shut and the remembrance concluded, the institution was irrevocably altered. Catherine departed possessing a fresh, unforeseen presence, validated by a segment of Philip's ancestry, holding significant symbolic influence. Camilla, degraded and enraged, retreated to Windsor without comment. Yet within the residence confines, allegiances realigned, speculation intensified, and a different story took shape. It was a narrative destined to challenge all connections in the royal household and prepare the groundwork for a time none were ready to face.
Aides started to discuss her in new terms, not merely as the Princess of Wales, but as a figure more complex, more significant. The quietude that previously surrounded her now vibrated with examination, conjecture, and subtle endorsement. However, for Catherine, the burden felt overwhelming. An event starting as a courteous summons had escalated into a pivotal incident she could not manage or evade. During the period after the remembrance, her official engagements were examined more intensely than previously. Her remarks were dissected for cryptic intentions. Her connections were mapped with analytical accuracy. Camilla, concurrently, retreated, though not in surrender. Within Windsor, she seethed in private, challenging allegiances, insisting on answers, and promising her degradation would not shape her heritage. Her intimate circle depicted an environment of rage blended with detached strategy. Camilla never articulated vengeance explicitly, yet her behaviors implied it. Private discussions occurred, supportive media liaisons were engaged, and nuanced storylines materialized. They suggested Catherine's ascendance was an artificial narrative, not an indicator of actual influence. The situation no longer concerned the remembrance, it concerned persistence, control, and the institution's trajectory. Inside the institution, the environment became highly charged. Veteran observers started murmuring about the validation's true significance. A few perceived it as a ritualistic anomaly. Others considered it the start of an influence realignment too large to overlook. Assistants devoted to Charles worried that if Catherine's momentum persisted, it might jeopardize the precise system they had protected for years. And yet some individuals, particularly in the younger cohort, felt this represented a much-delayed day of judgment. They believed the royal household could not continue to conceal the fissures behind its pristine facade. Perhaps Catherine's silent composure was precisely what the establishment required to weather the impending crisis. William discovered he was caught in the vortex of this turmoil. As a spouse, successor, and guardian, he was compelled to choose either cohesion or honesty. On one side were his father and Camilla, injured, defensive, and apprehensive about forfeiting command. On the opposing side, his spouse, unwillingly converted into an emblem of integrity, legacy, and the institution's ethical trajectory. William's lack of comment grew more meaningful than any statement. His confidants depicted an individual split in half, dedicated to harmony, yet acutely conscious that harmony was perhaps unattainable. And subsequently, suggestions emerged, murmurs that Philip's ancestry had not yet concluded their remarks. It was said that additional correspondence existed,
that more profound resentments were still concealed. These were resentments that, if exposed, might shatter the monarchical narrative entirely. The validation of Catherine had created the initial fissure, yet the underlying issues risked dismantling more than just custom. They could expose realities the institution had concealed for decades. And as the institution proceeds, a single fact persists. History has resurfaced, and it has not concluded its business with them.